I'm going to start with a question. How many people in this cemetery are dead? All of them. My name is Gottlieb Arthur John Siebold. I was born in a home 2 blocks south of the square in Red Bud, Illinois, where I lived with my mother and father, Gottlieb and Alma Siebold, and my sisters Nelda and Alberta. The ladybug. Wendy?
I know he's always yelling at me.
It's my daughter, Wendy.
I was always in trouble.
Okay. In my life, I was primarily an insurance agent for Ackerman Agency and a real estate agent for my company, Siebold Realty. I was a Mason and a Shriner. I was a charter member of the VFW in Red Bud and the American Legion in Prairie du Rocher. I managed the very popular Drum and Bugle Corps in Red Bud. I loved to golf and was one of the founders of the North County Country Club in Red Bud. Right over there. I even have the original drawing, of course, of the course, but I can't find it. It's somewhere. I was a founding contributor of the Belleville Area College campus here in Red Bud. I was a contributor to the Red Bud City Museum, where you can see my mother's wedding dress on display, I believe still. Better be. Okay, that's some of my story. And since Red Bud is celebrating 150 years, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about one of the original citizens of Red Bud, my grandfather, Gottlieb Siebold, who moved to Red Bud when the city was only 12 years old. Our story begins in the beautiful Black Forest of Germany on the Siebold Hof estate. The estate was built by the Siebold family in 1786, and members of the Siebold family still live there today, some 231 years later. Gottlieb's father was also named Gottlieb, so that makes me at least the 4th Gottlieb in the family. Okay, his father was very wealthy, but he liked to participate in the old German tradition of gambling, and he lost all of his money. So he and his wife moved to Wagenstadt, Germany, and that's where my grandfather was born in 1822, 45 years before the city of Red Bud was founded. When Gottlieb was only 14 years old, his mother became very ill and desperately needed medicine that was only available 30 miles from where they lived. Gottlieb volunteered to get the medicine and set out on foot. 2 days later, to everyone's amazement, Gottlieb returned with the medicine. Sadly, his incredible feat wasn't enough to save her, and both his mother and father died shortly after. So little Gottlieb was forced to move in with his grandmother. Wendy? Gottlieb loved to learn. Not only was he a good student, he used to go pick up the only copy of the newspaper that was delivered to Wagenstadt. He would run as fast as he could to pick up the paper so that he could walk back slowly and read it himself. This was one of his favorite stories to tell because he believed young people should not only go to school but read as much as they could in their own time. Even though he loved to learn, Gottlieb never went to college because his grandmother died and he couldn't afford it on his own. So he went to work at a small flouring mill. Later, he joined the army and fought during the Revolution of 1848, where he was shot, captured, and left for dead with several other soldiers in a dungeon. After several days without food or water, he and the other soldiers were rescued. After leaving the army, Gottlieb met a woman with a beautiful voice named Magdalena. Gottlieb and Magdalena became engaged in 1851 and made plans to come to the United States. During their 54-day journey across the sea, their boat caught fire and nearly sank. On the boat, Gottlieb brought with him several casks of wine, which he sold to passengers. He made enough money, and he and Magdalena could afford to get married once they arrived in New York. carrying many of their very belongings in this basket.
This is his original basket and the number he had on it.
There's a number on there too.
It was used to be at the Petersburg house. Now I have it.
Thank you, Wendy. While registering at the immigration station, he was asked to give his full name, but Gottlieb Siebold was his full name. So when they asked for his middle name, he said, "I don't have any." So they wrote down the letter E for any. After living in Poughkeepsie a while, he decided to follow the advice of Horace Greeley and go west. He intended to go to Kansas, but instead fell in love with the landscape of Missouri and bought a farm near California, Missouri. While living there, he served in the Southern Army during the Civil War. After the war, he bought a small flouring and woolen mill. It burned to the ground 6 weeks later. And since you couldn't get insurance back in those days, it was a total loss. But he was able to borrow money from his friends and rebuilt the mill. He later sold that successful mill and built another mill in Monroe City. Wait. Monroe City, Illinois. Okay.
There is a plaque there that says
There's a plaque that says everything that I just said. Unfortunately, a few years later, his wife Magdalena died. The couple had 8 children together, but 3 of them died when they were very young. One of their children, I believe you just heard about.
Oh, Nelson. Yeah.
Nelson.
Over in the castle.
A year later, he married Margaret Mueller, and in 1879 he moved to Redbud, where he bought the old Bricky Brothers mill on the north end of town. The mill has long since been torn down and replaced with a new mill, or newer mill, but the 2 Bricky residents are both still standing to this day on East Pine Street, where Gottlieb and his family lived across the street from where the old mill stood. In 1895, he built the Siebold Building in downtown Redbud. At the time, it was one of the largest buildings in the county, and he wasn't done yet. At 75 years of age, he walked to the top of Pikes Peak. At 86, he went to Europe to visit his daughter Mary, who moved to Switzerland and became a famous opera singer. Despite ups and downs in his life, both personally and professionally, Gottlieb was a remarkable man. He loved to sing, he had a photographic memory, and he always found a way to be successful in business. One of his favorite sayings was, "Save the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves." Learning from the misfortunes of his father, Gottlieb never once gambled or participated in any games of chance. While living in Redbud, he and my grandmother, Margaret, had 7 more children, 2 twins who died in infancy and 5 others who survived into adulthood, including my father, Gottlieb, who eventually took over the mill and the G. Siebold Milling Company. On the day after Christmas in 1911, and a few minutes past 6 p.m., my grandfather, Gottlieb Siebold, died in his home on East Pine Street in Redbud. He was buried in the Redbud City Cemetery at exactly 1 o'clock on December 29th, surrounded by a large group of mourners, hundreds of flowers from relatives, friends, and business acquaintances from across the country. During the 150-year celebration of Redbud, I encourage you to visit the old Redbud City Cemetery on the east edge of town and see the final resting spot of my grandfather, Gottlieb E. for any Siebold.